Hello again, this is Derek Taylor for HISD 103, and this is our next lecture. And this time we're going to be talking about early civilization of India. And first few lectures, we talked about the origins of human civilization, and then into the first earliest civilizations we're aware of, it's Sumer and Mesopotamia, then Egypt, and even to a lesser degree in the Americas. And we're coming in this to one of the oldest and most continuous, most continuity of a civilization in world history, and that's India. And I'll talk about its origins here a little bit, and then put this in the context of the stuff we've already talked about, make some comparisons. And also for this week, you're doing this reading. I'll also give you a short lecture on the earliest Greek civilizations. I'm going to put these in comparison with each other. I think there's some similarities there. And talk about, the things, in broad outline. This first section of the course is about the earliest civilizations and, looking for patterns, connections. And you're going to see there's some connections here with the earliest Indian civilizations and stuff you've already studied. So let me dive into this and get started. First thing to talk about early Indian civilization is its geography. There are basically three major geographical areas in India, the subcontinent. In Asia, I'll show you a map in a second. One are the Himalayan mountain barriers to the west. That's one obvious, barrier to it this way. Then there's the great river plains of the Indus and the Ganges River. See, and then of course there's the peninsula down in the south. That's the Deccan Peninsula, as it's called. And so this, again, like all the civilizations we studied so far, geography is important. Again, we don't need to be total materialists about this. You can get from listening to my lectures, I'm not, but it'd be wrong to discount it. It really does shape how people live. And in fact, here in India, it's where these great river valleys are that you're going to have the birth of its earliest civilizations and its later empires. It's going to be the key, much like in other areas we've already studied in the rest of the world. On the other hand, there are passes that go through the mountains, the famous passes going through places like Afghanistan and places like that, the Khyber Pass and the Bolan Pass. It can be invaded, and India has been invaded several times. We'll talk a little about this in this lecture because of that, and perhaps because of the geography, perhaps because it's been subject to, and it's not even necessarily always invasion, but peoples from Central Asia have long had a big influence in the Indian subcontinent. And so that's part of that, I don't just put it in terms of invasion, there is that, but there's also exchange, India will be part of the Silk Road later on in history when we get to this. Perhaps because of that reason, after its classical era, we'll get to the classical era in the next section of the course, it tends to be politically fragmented for a long time. So perhaps because of those things, because of its geography, I think, dictates a lot of this. And here's just the outline, and we'll talk about the Indus civilization first. I'll mention it several times because you're going to be reading some articles on this, that its written script is still undeciphered. So, and we don't really know how old, exactly how old, but each of the dates there, it's kind of, I put 25 to 1500, 1700, it depends, that earliest civilization. Aryan peoples come in, from around 1500 or so, at least they're settled by then. You'll have the Rigvedic period, which is, we'll talk about the earliest Vedic peoples and their Aryan civilization, later period. And it's later after that, you get the compositions of the last major religious text in the Indian tradition, down to about 500 BC. And after that, very latest period, you're going to have the composition of epic poems. We'll talk about that too. Epics are a big point of concession here. You're going to be reading or have read partly already the Epic of Gilgamesh, epics, and maybe I didn't talk about the genre of epic too much already. I probably did this in the video on the actual essay, but this, points of comparison with these other civilizations are important. So there is the outline, the chronology for you. And so the oldest civilization we're aware of in India is called the Indus Valley civilization because it arose in the Indus Valley. Couple of 2500 or so BCE. Interesting thing about India is that it's we say India, it has there are hundreds of dialects and languages in the subcontinent of India today, there are three major language families that sort of make up Indian society. And two of them were present before what we think of as being Indian society came into being. The Dravidian, this is, in the southern part of India, one of the language groups, present before Sanskrit. Sanskrit's the language of the Aryans, which we'll come back to. Probably came from the West, probably from Iran. There's a lot of overlap between Indian civilization and Iranian civilization in many respects, lots of connections. Another language group is called the Munda, also in the southern part of India. This language is present. Almost certainly came from the East and probably related to the languages of modern-day Cambodia. So it's more of an, Indo-Chinese type of language that gets into that period. The other major one, and we'll talk about them because it's important, one you're probably familiar with, is the language brought to India by the Aryan peoples from Central Asia, Sanskrit, of which Hindi, which I believe is one of the official languages, maybe the official language, Indian language of India, modern republic today, and Urdu are modern descendants of that language group. So we call India as kind of a mix, ultimately, of different peoples and their languages from an early period. And just to give you an idea, how old it is, we have, I mentioned this a little bit, I'll mention this a little bit with China, is that a lot of our English words for these ancient civilizations are mediated by other ancient civilizations. The early words for one of the early words for India, and this refers in Sanskrit to the Indus River, what we call the Indus River, is Sindhu. From Persian, we get Hindush, which is a name for both the river and people who live in the country around it. And then from Greek, we get the dropping of the H, and it's called Indos in Greek. And so we get that from these people. And I mention all that because India, as a civilization, has a very, again, early sense of identity. There is some of the earliest writings we have, a sense of there is a culture, a civilization occupied people of this place that is, around the Indus, and then outsiders. And this is illustrated by, in some of the earliest writings we have, the word Sanskrit, which I'm going to butcher here, Mleka. The Sanskrit word Mleka means something like barbarians. So again, you want to parallel with the Greeks, there you go. From an early period, they're making a distinction between people who are insiders and outsiders, as all cultures sort of do, but it's that sort of old and has a sort of self-conscious identity about it. China is similar to a certain degree in this regard. But the earliest one, again, is sometimes called Indus or Harappan culture. And it arises, you can kind of see here, in northwestern India, around the Indus River Valley. And there are two major cities, Harappa up in what is the Punjab, up here. Here you have, of course, mountains in the west. This is the Iranian plateau to the west. And down here you have these two cities, Harappa in the center, and then Mohenjo-Daro. And these are the two major, places, cities of this early civilization. Notice, by the way, there's a dry area here. The Punjab is more wet, but they're along the Indus River Valley, and they're there because the Indus River provides what the Nile and the Tigris and Euphrates provided for Egyptians and Mesopotamians. They provide flooding and therefore soil, and that's how they they became a great agricultural civilization here. And so you kind of see the southern parts here. And this will be the area where the Aryans settle later on. But for the moment, this concentrate on the Indus civilization. But note, this is mostly we're talking about here early civilizations. Evidence of them comes from the north, comes from the northwestern part of India, which again makes sense, right? They're in contact. The northwest parts are the most open to other civilizations, so it's interesting that that's the case. Now, the Indus civilization is in some ways, it's kind of interesting. It was only discovered by archaeologists in the 1920s. Until then, we thought that the civilization represented by the Vedic peoples, the Aryans, and the collection of hymns called the Vedas, or the Rig Veda collection, was the only India we knew. In other words, it turned out it was even older than we already suspected. And as I mentioned earlier, and I'll mention it again because it'll get into your readings for this week, their writing system is still undeciphered. So we don't know everything we want to know about this people. We don't know a lot about their beliefs, especially. What we do know is that it was huge. Let me go back for a second. It's twice as large in land area, this Harappan or Indus civilization, as was Mesopotamia or Egypt. Much larger. Those ring of city-states in between the two rivers, not nearly as big. Let me go back for just a second and show you the map. This is, again, maybe you can't tell from the scale, this is a lot bigger, a lot bigger territory than what you had in Mesopotamia. I should have showed you another map, perhaps. And in fact, the two biggest cities are Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. They have populations of well over 35,000 people. In fact, I've seen some estimates that I think it's Harappa had 42,000 people. So it depends on who you ask. But even more than this, these are all basically homogeneous archaeological sites. And there are more than just those. There are literally 1,000 sites have been discovered who have the same culture, the same building styles, everything else across that massive, massive landmass. And you can kind of see this. And there are at least 3 other cities, 5 real cities, that kind of size besides Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. And more than this, they clearly have centralized governments. They still have civic buildings, civic architecture. I'll show you a little bit of a building from Mohenjo-Daro in a second. So they're big. They have, the kind of civic palaces, civic buildings you'd expect, and they are organized pretty well. We're not really sure if it's one single empire or something. Again, it's hard to tell, but they're definitely the exact same culture, and they're pretty widespread in that period. Now, I'm repeating myself here with Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, how homogenized they are, centralized governments, the populations. But more than this, they are cities laid out in structured grids. Again, very similar. Again, when I say structured, as well laid out as the pyramids are in Egypt. They also construct large temple complexes, similar to the Near East. They construct large, granary systems, which are, again, very similar to what you'd see in ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia with, you have sections for brewers and bakers and then slaves and stuff like this built into it. The most unique thing, and this is what everybody mentions about these two cities, are their complex systems of drains and sewers. And this is the interesting thing about them. They have the kind of drainage system that you won't see private houses with bathrooms in them until Roman times. It's that complex, and it's very interesting. And I mentioned before, you have these sites here. And just to mention one other thing about them, they have the biggest complex in both of these cities are mound complexes, raised mound complexes in each of these cities on the western part of the border of the city. A rested platform made of mud and mud brick, sometimes as many as like 33 feet high off ground level. And so, again, you have, types of things you might find elsewhere in the world. Again, I'm thinking of actually the civilizations of the Americas, because we're going to talk about this later on. There'll be, mound builders in North America. So it's fascinating, the sort of, contrasts here, but also some similar things. You'll see this when we get to ancient Greece as well. But very sophisticated, more sophisticated in some ways than Mesopotamia and even Egypt, perhaps. And this, by the way, is one section of one wall of Mohenjo-Daro. And you can kind of see, look at how, you have different shapes put together. It looks, how the brick, it looks like a modern brick house or something. They're laid out in very precisely in these cities. And it's kind of interesting because it is these big cities. This is an agricultural society. It is dependent. It's based on the flooding of the Indus rivers, and they're still using stone tools, but it's pretty much a Bronze Age society. Despite all this, they are still able to again have lots of buildings like this and create things like this. We find other types of metal used there as well. We know, by the way, that their seals and other items will find their way into Mesopotamia. There's clearly trade going on with places like Akkad and the Sumerians with the Indus civilization in its early formations. So, and one of the things, by the way, we'll get to this in a moment, they leave behind a bunch of really amazing sculptures, bronze and stone sculptures a lot of them of animals and other interesting figures, really interesting figures, which have, as I mentioned before, symbols on them. We can't really make clear what it is they're actually saying, unfortunately. And this is one of the things to note about its religion, is we really don't know what the link is to the later incarnation of Aryan religion later on, which is so much more prominent. But we do know that you have images of what seem to be anthropomorphic divinities, some of whom look like later Hindu divinities. One in particular, there are images of a figure that looks like the Hindu god Shiva. There are a bunch of terracotta figurines made of women who are wearing heavily ornamented dresses and earrings and necklaces. And again, it's hard to figure out what exactly they're for, but they're very sophisticated, and it's kind of interesting. There are certain stone artifacts that, they seem to represent, they represent representations of male and female genitalia, right? This is to do with fertility and stuff like this. But it's hard to tell, even though they have these big structures. It's not, I mentioned they build big temples. It's not clear they're making sacrifices there, because we can't tell, because we can't read the writing. So there's a lot that's left unclear about the Indus River Valley civilization. It's mysterious. That's kind of reason you'll see why I gave you the readings I gave you for this week, and it's kind of interesting to think about the fact that we didn't even know they existed until 100 years ago. And here you can see the layout of I think this is Harappa. I cannot be clear, but you can kind of see just how geometrical it is, just how precise it is. You have bathhouses, you have granary. It says college. I don't know what that means. I don't know if they've identified a school or anything. I don't know. Ask me. And then you have the largest complex there, a stupa. Just how big this thing is. Look at the measure of it. 200 meters. That's 200 meters, 200 yards. Just, this thing's over 200 yards in one part of its circumference. I mean, it's pretty amazing. All right. This is, again, something we didn't even suspect existed. But shows the sophistication of the Indus Valley civilization, right? So what happens to this Indus civilization? Why do we all of a sudden forget about it? There are lots of theories about this. The Indus cities are all basically come to an end about 1900 BC, and we're not really sure why. The Indus script goes extinct. Writing will have to be reinvented later on in Indian civilization. And the fact of the matter is, we don't really know that much about why it happened. There are theories that it has to do with some sort of major disaster, either a natural disaster, flooding, for example, flooding and ecological damage destroyed the cities. We know, by the way, these cities were destroyed by floods and rebuilt several times. Or perhaps ecological causes, maybe working the soil to death, or internal causes, just loss of civilizational, morale or something, or military invasion. This has been one of the theories. This was one of the theories. It still has some currency today. There were, as we'll get to the Aryans, they did invade later on in their history. But, however, it does seem like the decline definitely predates the arrival of these Aryan peoples, even though they did conquer some parts of India. So that's not necessarily a slam dunk. As far as flooding goes, there are parts of Mohenjo-Daro that were flooded and rebuilt at least 3 times. In other words, you begin to see, and there is, by the way, there's some parts of these cities where it does look like people died violent deaths. So there's some evidence for that. But it's just hard to say at this point. Again, the cause of its passing is still kind of undetermined. That's one of the interesting things about this civilization. We just don't know enough about it. And so it passes into history around 1700 BC. Again, I'm not even sure. I don't think the Indian peoples themselves knew it existed. So the mysterious Indus River Valley civilization. And here you can see this is one of those animal seals. Again, you can kind of see this is the script, apparently, of Indus River Valley culture we can't figure out, and was obviously a large oxen of some sort. And you can see how sophisticated this is. but it's again testament to how you've seen it with the Egyptian pyramids, you've seen it with some of the stuff in Mesopotamia, how sophisticated some of these people could be in their culture. And I don't know, it's something to reflect on and how they just died out. It happens in world history, and not everything's eternal. So that is the Indus River Valley civilization in brief. So what follows this is the rise of the Vedic peoples. I'm going to talk about the word Aryan in a second, but right is what we think of as Vedic civilization, which becomes predominant, it will give form and shape to what we think of as being India for many, many centuries. And in particular, it is the people that are associated with what we call Aryans, peoples from Central Asia, semi-nomadic warriors from Central Asia who did invade the northwest of India and starting about 1700 or so, or some around there, and are well established in the archaeological records by 1500. These people were Indo-Europeans. They spoke an Indo-European language. That means they're part of the language family that includes Iran and different parts of Europe, European languages from Central Asia. So they're part of that. They're part of the long tradition, which I haven't put on the slide. I'll mention this in so many lectures, but these people from the central part of Eurasia or the steppes of the Central Asia, they're so important because they invade and they bring to an end so many civilizations, especially in the first part of this survey of world history you're going to take. And so they're part of this, and they are completely different from the Indus River Valley civilization. They have no cities. They are mostly horsemen and cattle herders, and they like fighting. They fight a lot, as we'll get to in a moment. Is a warrior kind of society. They valorize warfare, and they look upon themselves in this way. This is probably why this term gets misapplied, Aryans, and why I'm using the term Vedic so much, is that if you don't know, that term got applied by the Nazis to what they thought to Germanic races, which they thought were superior, so they called it the Aryan race or the master race. And this is a distortion of an idea that went back to the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who was talking about something a little different. But the idea was that they were these superior warrior types, and the Nazis took this and turned it into something horrific and evil. But it basically just refers to people. I believe the term Aryan actually means in Sanskrit something like nobility. And this is something that actually cuts across these civilizations. Nobility is basically synonymous with warrior to a certain degree. In the earliest Greek civilizations, aristocrat, aristos, means best or rule of the best, best meaning best warriors. So you kind of have that sensibility that they're a warrior society, and they're pretty straightforward about that. And what's going to happen is the Aryans are going to basically project their culture over basically all of North India and leave their mark there. They'll bring the new language of Sanskrit. They're going to bring a very different social organization, as we're going to see, based on their sort of nomadic, semi-pastoral way of life. They're going to bring different techniques of warfare into this period, things like chariots and stuff like that. Remember, we talked about in the last episode, chariots being the big thing from like 1500 or so. And then finally, maybe most importantly, the religious forms and ideas they bring into North India still shape the peoples of the subcontinent today. They're very, very consequential, part of the heritage of world civilizations as a whole. So the first thing to note about this is that most of our information about the Aryans come from hymns, or a group of hymns that are called Vedas. And in particular, one group in this literature, which is called Rig Veda, which is a collection of 1,028 hymns to the gods, arranged in 10 sections. And there are all different sorts of things involved in this. The word Veda, it means knowledge, and knowledge of not just hymns, but of private, basically liturgical collections of families or clans that were joined together. Other things are details about ritual. I'll get to this in a second. They really have a serious emphasis on ritual. And in fact, one of the things that the Rig Veda is going to stress is something called Rita. Rita is sort of like, it's kind of hard to make this clear. It's sort of like the laws of nature, I guess, in science, except that Rita is, it's moral, I guess, and spiritual as well as physical. Think of it almost like a ritual science, because it is kind of connected to, well, it's connected to sacrifice, because this is something that this is really the center of Vedic religion is sacrifice, which is, excuse me, it's focused on Agni, which is the sacred fire, the focal point of the sacrifices. And yeah, and so you get a lot of knowledge about what these people look like. They're, again, stock breeders and farmers. And you have in the Veda, Rig Veda, you have teams of horses drawing the chariot of the sun daily across the heavens. They are very much, again, a sort of warrior class who thinks of themselves in these terms. And it's hard to overemphasize the nature of sacrifice here, just how much it matters. Just give you an idea. There's all sorts of, again, there's all sorts of details. It's so extensive, is the Rig Veda in terms of, who the sacrificer is, what kind of feast it's going on, aspects of this, the sacrificer had to be in this literature, the sacrificer in this sacrifice has to be an adult married Aryan, has to be initiated into Vedic religion. It has to have all these sorts of things. It becomes so detailed that you have again, it becomes amazingly detailed over time. And in fact, it became so important that to the priestly caste of early Vedic society that eventually they invented forms that are so demanding they could have never actually been forms of sacrifice, that could never actually have been performed. There's actually a sacrifice, for example, in the Rig Veda that supposedly takes 1,000 years to complete. This is, again, kind of amazing. And what's going to happen, we'll get to this in a moment, it's going to change over time, but this is part and parcel will become later on Hinduism, but it's based on this earlier set of texts. And on the other hand, you get to the later part of the Vedic age, the late Vedic age, you're going to have the dominance of this priestly class, the Brahmin class, which is responsible for those classics. We'll get to this caste system in a moment, the Varna system. But in the very end of this, the very tail end of this work, you have works written probably, again, after 500 BC, about 400 to 200, which portray, though, the lives of these sort of Vedic warriors from an earlier period. And these two major ones we're going to talk about here, these two epics, are the Mahabharata, which is the world's longest epic poem, and which has to do with, they both concern themselves with kingdoms in the Ganges River Valley. And in fact, you have the Mahabharata is basically attributed to a single author, but it's actually the outgrowth of a long oral tradition. There's a lot of material added over time between about different kings and warriors, and it's essentially a heroic tale about battle between two different clans among the Aryans. And again, I'm mentioning this because this, along with the Ramayana is the adventures of a legendary king named King Rama. It's more like, it seems to have one author to it. It's more unitary in form. And they basically keep alive through writing down essentially of the oral tradition about these great earlier Vedic warriors. And I mention this partly because these are great artifacts of early Indian civilization, but because they have a parallel. I'm going to talk about in the next lecture the earliest Greek civilizations, Minoan and Mycenaean. And of course, the Mycenaean warriors are also, they're kind of more or less they're almost contemporaneous with the Vedic warriors of India. They also have their own poems that recall their exploits. Those are called the Homeric poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, which are also written down in a much later time period and the result of an oral tradition. So again, for some of these, early civilizations, like Egypt, civilization's a much more, it seems like a more civilized thing. For a lot of them, the Vedic civilization, the early Greek civilizations, they're warrior civilizations. So it's interesting, again, some of the parallels you can draw here in terms of how these things go. And finally, one last thing about society and religion before I finish this up, early Indian civilization. The first thing that I mentioned, there was a definitely different social structure. The first thing is that Vedic social structure is patrilineal, means descent from the father, but it's patriarchal and it is a warrior society. This is essentially tribal sort of society ruled by sort of clans or tribes, and very much in the like, again, and think about I'm thinking about the Homeric poems, like the House of Agamemnon and stuff like this. You kind of see it this way. And the basic unit of these societies was the extended family, consisting of a householder, his unmarried daughters, his sons and sons, their wives. And the family was kind of, in Vedic society, as far as we can tell, a corporation. It owned property as a unit. And so you had, a sort of, patriarchal society ruled by essentially a tribal manner. And in fact, you're going to have the leaders of these, tribes are ruled by Raja or chieftains in terms of its organization, which again is what you expect in a, one term for this is heroic society. Heroic society is sort of, equivalent to a warrior society. So, and again, you proceed on this fact. Aryan society seems to have originated in a very simple distinction between nobles and commoners. When they first got to India, they actually fought with and overcame peoples that were called Dasa. Apparently, they were darker skinned peoples whom they conquered. And in fact, the word Dasa would come over time to denote, well, slaves. So again, Friedrich Nietzsche didn't get this out of nowhere, but they came to see themselves as this sort of warrior class ruling over this very tribal society. One thing to note about Vedic society is it also had slavery. Again, like all ancient societies, it's based on this, and it practiced, for the most part, a form of debt slavery, very similar to that which was prevalent in Mesopotamia. So kind of like those societies, very sharp and hard distinction, very hard social distinctions. And in the latter part of the Vedic age, of course, you have the rise of a system, a tribal system of four varnas or classes. You can see the breakdown there. We already mentioned Brahmins. They are the priests. Kshatriya, warrior or noble class. You have Vaishyas, or peasants or tradesmen. And you have the lowest class, the Shudra. And they are the sort of those to whom knowledge of the Veda is denied. And this is something that, of course, is going to come to dominate all of Indian society. By the way, caste no longer legally exists in the modern Indian Republic, but the social distinction still is there. But this will lay a foundation that goes on for centuries, because this sort of, patrilineal extended family unit is going to be the basis based on these sort of four castes. And they're elaborating. It's going to change over time. Don't get me wrong, but it's going to be elaborated in a much more intense way going forward. Again, it leaves its mark on Indian civilization pretty much ever after. And one final thing to note about the Vedic peoples is that as you go farther and farther into time, I mentioned this before, what's going to happen is sacrifice, which is so crucial to the early Vedic text. And some of the early Vedic texts, by the way, early creation story, one of the early creation stories in the Vedic text is a god being sacrificed and his body parts being, used to make the universe and all this stuff. Well, what happens is it becomes, in the later text, as you go on in time, so much more abstract that it becomes almost a principle unto itself. In later texts, and this will be portrayed most definitively in the Upanishads. the later texts of the Vedic tradition, which are much less concerned with sacrifice and which are much more philosophical in nature and which reduce the idea of principle to one single principle, the doctrine of Brahman, the one single transcendent principle of reality, the absolute from which all beings derive their being. And so it goes really quick. It goes over the centuries from being a sacrifice-based to being this philosophical idea in Vedic terms. And we're going to talk about this a little later because this will feed into this direction of going toward more philosophical reflection on these things rather than the emphasis on the ritual of sacrifice. Will feed into changes in what we call the Axial Age after 500 or so. In India, the development of the great religions of asceticism, Buddhism, and other belief systems that arise. So it feeds into that trend. One last thing, just to mention the important gods of the Vedic pantheon. The most famous one, the most popular one, is Indra. Again, it's a warrior society. They devote lots of time to what they call the devas, the shining ones, the gods associated with the sky. The most of the gods they are invested in this Vedic literature are sky gods, and they're mostly male, by the way. In fact, if you don't know, there's a crossover. The name for the name for there's some parallels between the names for Zeus, the names for Jupiter in Latin, Zeus in Greek, and I think it's Deus Pitar in Sanskrit. Again, they all sound like some sort of similar sky god, father god, right? So that's part of this. But Indra is the most important one for the Vedic warriors because they're all, well, that's what they are. They're warriors. Varuna is the god who is the god of cosmic order, was also venerated. And then Anu, we've already mentioned, is the sort of sacred fire, and so related to sacrifice and priests. And that, by the way, the whole idea of just one last element of connections here. Agni and fire is going to be important when we talk about later on in Persian civilization, the religious aspect of that civilization as well. So you see all these. There is definitely a pattern of Indo-European language, Indo-European religion at work in early Indian civilization, and so I hope this was interesting for you. Give you a little background on some of the text you'll read in a few weeks for the Axial Age. And you'll see for this week, we're going to talk about some of the mysteries of it and the language and why we can't decipher it. But very interesting, again, some of the parallels, also the uniqueness vis-a-vis some of the civilizations you've already encountered. So that's the lecture on early Indian civilization. And we'll talk about next time, leave off talking about next time, the earliest Greek civilizations. Minoan and Mycenaean civilization, and they'll bring to a close the section. A couple of weeks ago, be closely closed. Be one of the last civilizations we'll talk about in this early period. We'll finish up with China, and that'll be all for this week. So, lecture on early Greek civilizations coming up. Thank you guys for listening. Enjoy the rest of your week.